Okay, so we are live according to StreamYard and YouTube. Hopefully the audio is good. I'll keep my eye on the chat in case it's not. So tonight I'm going to be reviewing a video, and I didn't realize until the day that Steve McRae did it, but Steve McRae has also done a review of this video, so I planned mine for a few days after his. I didn't know he was going to do one, so I don't think he's going to accuse me of being a copycat, but I did want to mention that I wasn't doing it just because he did one. I will be reviewing a discussion that was had between Aron Ra and Dr. Joshua Sijuwade, if I am pronouncing that correctly. I think I am, but I might not be. This was had in 2019, if I remember correctly. It was at the Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park in the United Kingdom, in England, and it was an interesting discussion. It's not the worst performance I've ever seen by an atheist against a theist, but it was a discussion that I would really enjoy going over, just because I think there's some good I think there's some things, as bad as it might sound, and I don't mean it to sound bad, but I think there's a sense in which Aron can be used as an example here, and just pointing a few things out, just in the sense of showing people why, personally, I think it is good that people have not just a respect and an appreciation for philosophy, but an understanding of it, rather than dismissing it as some useless obfuscatory tool that theists have. It should be something that I think a lot of atheists should embrace themselves, because I think that largely online atheists don't do that. So this is only, it's just under half an hour long, so I don't expect this review to go over about an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes. But let's jump right in here.
Content of everything! Content of everything!
You said before that you used to be a Christian. I just wanted to know the reason why you stopped being a Christian.
The day I was reborn in Christ.
Okay, can you
detail that day I found myself just kind of like floating around in a euphoria, like a daze. It often happens. It doesn't happen just to Christians either. I've heard people talk about accepting Krishna and going. The Beatles talk about something similar. So I know it happens in every religion. But I remember asking a friend of mine, who is now a Southern Baptist minister running a Christian school, who really teaches creationism. Oh, yeah, but he was my best friend in high school. I asked him, how do I know that this is really Jesus and that I'm not just fooling myself? And he grabbed me by both shoulders with a huge beaming smile and said, just keep telling yourself it's Jesus until you believe it. Right. Instantly not a Christian anymore.
Wow, he really dropped the ball there.
That was so dishonest. Now, he really believes in fake it till you make it.
I see.
He preaches that. Lie to yourself until you believe it. That's his faith.
Just an interesting point.
So I just wanted to stop here just to point out that I think there is a point being made here, but I also think that it's oftentimes overgeneralized a little bit, or not overgeneralized, over-applied a little bit. And that is the point that what Aron is talking about is dealing with like very fundamentalist Christians. And I think that there's a lot of atheist activists out there, especially on the internet, that came from a very fundamentalist Christian background. And I think that oftentimes can drive what I would consider to be something that is, I wouldn't really say fundamentalist, but sort of a leaning dogmatic way of thinking about even atheism. Because I don't think that any particular perspective on the world is necessarily immune to those things. So I think there is legitimacy in pointing out that a lot of atheists come from very fundamentalist backgrounds, and that they speak out like Aron does, vehemently speak out against it. And Aron is, in my opinion, one of the world's, and I mean that literally, one of the world's greatest champions in tackling fundamentalist Christianity. I think that there are very few people, at least in the modern age, particularly those that are very much online, that do as good of a job as he does. So I have to give the man credit where credit is due, especially in this video, because I will be largely critiquing a lot of what he says in this video. But the other thing I wanted to mention is not everyone who is a Christian is a fundamentalist, and so will not have the same positions or make the same arguments or what have you. And not every atheist that came out of Christianity themselves came out of fundamentalism. I did not. I came out of a progressive Catholic community. I have nobody in my family has ever attacked me or done anything for becoming an atheist. I have been perfectly allowed to do that. So there are people that did come from better backgrounds that also aren't going to have the same perspectives on fundamentalist Christianity. I mean, I'm very much opposed to it, but being that I've never lived being I was never a creationist. I was never an evolution denier. I never any of that. So I don't know what it's like to believe or be convinced of those things. So I just wanted to point that out there, that I think there's a benefit in calling out fundamentalism. I think there's a discussion for fundamentalism in terms of how we see it in religions in Christianity, or rather in atheism, in atheist circles. But we need to remember that not all religious believers are fundamentalists, and not all people who are non-religious came from a previously fundamentalist religious background.
Is there not some truth to that, of when you something akin to a concept like manifesting destiny, a certain thing, of that if you want to will something into existence, it might in some sense manifest itself in your life? I don't mean actually.
Law of attraction is what this guy is trying to mention. The idea that if you think about something or just will for something to happen hard enough for long enough, that eventually it will happen. I say that if you do that and then you do everything you can to actually physically apply yourself, there's a greater probability that it'll happen, but no guarantee, because that's called working for something.
I mean, in your perception,
I know that people believe that there are people who believe that if I believe hard enough, then reality will change according to the power of their will.
Right.
And if it doesn't, they've convinced themselves anyway, so they wouldn't know if it hadn't.
That's it. Yeah.
So it's either way, it's a delusion.
Yeah. But I mean, just trying to understand that what that Baptist preacher was saying to you is not historical Christianity. Historical Christianity would say, my understanding of it would be, not that you just believe it, even though despite the evidence, you believe it in line with the evidence. There's always been. So I would say that there is evidence in form of Christianity for theism and for Christian theism specifically.
Okay, pick one.
Yeah, so I would say, what you want to go theism or?
It's not first time.
Yeah, I know. So okay, the way I'll think about it is that I would say that the evidence has to render the hypothesis probable. And the way that we can understand that is the simplest hypothesis that leads us to expect the evidence is most probably true. I would say that there is a God. The proposition, the hypothesis that there is a God is the simplest hypothesis that we have that leads us to expect the evidence of, number one, that there is a universe, that this universe exists.
We're going to assume there's a God, and therefore there must be a universe?
No. So I'm saying when you are looking at an inductive hypothesis, you will formulate the hypothesis, and then.
So already, if you haven't picked up what Joshua has, at least initially here, not saying that his plan was to talk about it the whole discussion, but that was probably just the first thing that popped into his head. But he's essentially alluding to the contingency argument.
You will have to.
Hey, sure. How do you do? All right.
And for those who don't know, that is Subur Ahmed, my bad. I have never had a discussion with him. I can't say I have any immediate issues with him. I disagree with him vehemently on certain things, but I can't say that I have any immediate issues with him as a person. But him and Aron have previously spoken at Speaker's Corner. I don't know if it was at this same Speaker's Corner event in the same day. Maybe it was over a weekend. I don't really know the nature of the event here, if it was just a gathering that happened or whether it was planned or what have you. But so the thing is here, Immutable, is that when I first saw this video, immediately I knew that, okay, he's right there. He's alluding to the contingency argument. The one thing I want to say, and I'm not necessarily attacking Aron for this, so I want to make that clear, but I just want to say, tell me, I want you to think about how long you think it takes for Aron to realize that Joshua is running a contingency argument.
When you're looking at the inductive hypothesis, you will formulate the hypothesis, H, and you'll have the evidence, and you'll say, well, by a certain criteria, does this hypothesis lead us to expect the evidence when we would not expect it? So if the hypothesis was false, we would not expect to have this evidence.
Okay, so as we mentioned before,
Yes.
evidence is the fact that indicates. So what is the fact that indicates a God?
No, so evidence is just simply a proposition that corresponds to reality.
It's a body of facts.
Yeah, so you can state it that way. Okay, so the proposition to reality.
It's a God.
No, so evidence is just simply a proposition that corresponds to reality.
It's a body of facts.
Yeah, so you can state it that way. Okay, so the proposition that there is a universe.
And see, the way Joshua construed that, the way Dr. Joshua construed construed evidence there, that it's sort of a proposition that leads you to accept some sort of conclusion. You know, it's a little general, but I think it works. And I think that in a lot of these kinds of discussions, it's okay to be a little bit more general with what you mean by evidence. You don't need to be referring to one particular type of evidence. Personally, I think I would define evidence as something. Well, for me, I define it as that which confers justification for the acceptance of the belief in some proposition or set of propositions or what have you. But I think that seems to be along the lines of what Joshua was saying there. I think that's a fairly reasonable definition for evidence.
Okay.
Not
That
a
the universe
dispute.
exists. Okay, we're not disputing. That's the evidence. Now,
Wait,
what-
no, that's not evidence. That's the fact.
Yeah, but I'm saying an evidence. You're taking it in as evidence.
That's circular reasoning. That's
It's not
the
circular
question-begging fallacy.
How is that? Sorry.
That's assuming, that's calling it creation, expecting a creator.
No.
When if we call it reality, we don't expect a realtor.
No. So can I speak? So when you are looking at something, you will go and say, this is evidence that I am then trying to explain by my hypothesis. If my hypothesis fails to explain it, then it cannot be evidence that supports.
All right, and
the
in order to
hypothesis.
be a hypothesis, it has to be tested
Yes.
and
By
falsifiable.
No, I would not say that. Depends.
Well, then it can't be tested.
So I will try and.
If you can't falsify it, it can't
One
test it.
second. One second. I'll try and say. One second. I'll try and say firstly, you need the reason why I denied it at the beginning is it depends how you define it.
Hold on.
I'll try and say firstly, you need the reason.
I'm trying to figure out what this guy in the white hat said back here. I can't.
One second.
Can't falsify it, it can't test it.
One second. I'll try
Okay,
and say-
so yeah, he said exactly what I thought he said. He said if you can't falsify it, well, that's the fundamental principle. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say it was Karl Popper that introduced the principle of falsification in the philosophy of science in terms of developing what a good scientific model or a good scientific theory is. I thought it was Karl Popper. I don't want to try to take the time to find it right now. I think it's Karl Popper, but I could be wrong. I think that there is a sense in which you can have a model that might not. See, this is where the notion of falsification, I think, it can extend even outside of just purely our empirical methodologies, purely our scientific methodologies. I think that you can have metaphysical explanations or metaphysical models for things, moral models for things, epistemological models that could be falsified, but they wouldn't be falsified by any empiric. They would be falsified by a contradiction in terms or some sort of other conceptual issue. So I think that falsification is important for any model, but I think when Aron is speaking about falsification here, I think he's probably speaking in terms of more an empirical falsification. And for empirical models, yes, you need empirical falsification, but I would argue that you can falsify an empirical model without any empiric whatsoever if you can point to a conceptual issue that it has. So the discussion about falsification, I think, is a lot more both broad and nuanced than it's made out to be.
One second. I'll try and say firstly, the reason why I denied it at the beginning is it depends how you define falsifiability. So if you can
Exactly. Yes, it depends on what you mean by falsifiability.
Just explain to me what you mean by falsifiability.
If anything is,
Yes.
if you propose a hypothesis,
Yes.
there has to be a way. You can't always prove it right,
Yes.
right? So I mean, there's a rule that
Yes.
you can't prove anything right
Yes.
in science,
Yes.
because if you do, then we lead to the religious thing about asserting absolute truth.
Yes.
But you can prove things false.
Yes.
So if you have propose a hypothesis, first it must be backed by evidence. We still haven't gotten to that. The hypothesis has to be based on evidence for there to be a hypothesis. We still don't have evidence of God. Then the hypothesis there has to be a way to disprove it. If it's wrong, there has to be a way to show that it is wrong. So if you have a hypothesis that there is a God, there's got to be a way to test it.
Yes.
And if it fails that
Yes.
test, it proves there is no God.
Yes, yes. So I would say, okay, there is a certain criteria that you will utilize, scientific criteria or historical criteria when you're trying to assess a hypothesis. Does the evidence I have support the hypothesis according to this criteria?
Okay, let's
So
start
firstly,
with,
I would say,
first you have to have the evidence for
Yeah.
the hypothesis.
yeah.
So
I'm
what
not-
evidence?
I'm not disputing that. But can I just say about the criteria first?
Right.
See if you agree with me with the criteria or not. Okay, so firstly, the hypothesis has to lead us to expect the evidence. Okay. Secondly, the evidence cannot.
Why
Yes.
why would it lead us to expect? Okay, so that's if the hypothesis
Is
passed, then we would put down a prediction. If the hypothesis is successful, it would be like this. Can't prove it right, but it lines up with what we predicted. That's what you're saying?
No, so no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you are saying something is so, and you are bringing in something to say why it is so, the thing that you are bringing as a hypothesis that explains that data needs to explain the data. So I'll give you an example.
It seems to me that what Joshua's trying to do here is sort of lay out in a more detailed manner what he's meaning when he says that you have what it means to say you have evidence for something. You would say that X is evidence for Y if X accounts for, bear with me here, Y is observed in the world. If it can't do that, then it seems that then X wouldn't be evidence for Y if it couldn't account for Y. And I think that's pretty spot on personally. That's largely, I think, a good way to construe evidence. X is evidence for Y if X can account for Y is observed.
If it's a test,
Can I give you an example? So I don't agree with the moral argument that people bring for the existence of God. Okay, so you have people like William Lane Craig and other Christian philosophers who will bring in the moral argument that says moral values support God's existence. I don't believe that. I believe moral values are necessary. They're necessary moral principles, and they will exist irrespective of God. So you cannot use that as evidence because it will be there even if the hypothesis was false. But if you have a hypothesis that leads you to expect the evidence when it should not be expected, then that can be used as evidence for the hypothesis.
It sounds like you're talking about testing a hypothesis, and the hypothesis doesn't fail.
Okay, yes.
Okay, so it aligns with what you predicted. If I'm right, we should expect data like this.
Yeah,
The hypothesis produces data like this, so you might be right.
Yes.
Okay, but there also has to be a way to falsify it,
Yes,
or it doesn't qualify.
Yes. So if the hypothesis claims that something is so, okay, and that doesn't happen, okay, you don't find the evidence or whatever, then you can go and say that evidence then renders the hypothesis as improbable.
Okay, so how do we show a falsifiable hypothesis for God?
Okay, so I would simply go through the procedure of saying, okay, firstly the criteria that we should expect the evidence, that the evidence shouldn't, we shouldn't find the evidence if the hypothesis was false.
Okay.
It has to fit with our background evidence or background knowledge of the world.
Okay.
And then fourthly, it has to be a simple hypothesis. Fit with our background, we shouldn't.
I'm just going to rewind it because I want everybody to hear that again. I think he does a really good job here laying out these points.
Find the evidence if the hypothesis that the evidence shouldn't, we shouldn't find the evidence if the hypothesis was false.
Okay.
It has to fit with our background evidence or background knowledge of the world.
Okay.
And then fourthly, it has to be a simple hypothesis.
Okay.
So I would go and say that the propositional hypothesis that there is a God, that there is a personal being who's omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, is the simplest hypothesis that leads us to expect, number one,
The simplest hypothesis would be if you didn't add that he's perfectly good.
Oh, no, not
The simplest not be that there was no creator at all.
No.
And it just exists.
No, what's it?
Yeah,
more
that's much more simple.
So okay.
I mean, yeah, I agree. Naturalism, I think, is intrinsically simpler than theism, and I think that the prior probability of naturalism is intrinsically higher than that of theism. But I still think that it serves a naturalist well to have strong arguments in favor of their worldview.
1 second. Can I explain?
And that includes strong counter arguments to the arguments that theists would present.
So I would say that, just not going to that point first, let me just
go
explain to him.
for it.
Then, yeah, okay. So that there is a God is a simplest hypothesis that leads us to expect, number one, that there is a universe, that the universe is conformed to simple natural laws.
Well, I have to agree with him. The simplest hypothesis
Yes.
is where we don't add a God,
No, why would that be?
because we're adding something.
Yes.
We don't need to add.
But then, if you say there is no God, you then have to go and say, what is the ultimate reality? What is the ultimate explanation for that there is a universe? Yes, the universe itself.
Okay.
But the universe itself is
No,
not
no,
simple.
I'm not saying that the universe is evidence of the universe.
No, I'm not saying it's evidence for the universe.
Okay.
But there has to be an ultimate explanation for why there is a universe. And you will go and say, well,
What if
just
we don't
here.
know it?
It's a brute fact.
What if we don't know it?
You might say it's a brute fact.
No. What if we say we don't know?
Yes, so you'll go and say,
And here, see, this is immediately where I would have just mentioned that, well, that seems to be reference to the principle of sufficient reason, which it is. And I reject the principle of sufficient reason. And this is where, this is, I would say, for our first instance of having a strong understanding of some of these things can help, because objecting to the contingency argument, I don't think is that hard when, if you understand the principle of sufficient reason and just call that into question. I don't think that there's a good argument for why one needs to be committed to the PSR. I think one can just say, look, I don't think there's any reason to be committed to it. So I take the case that it's not really a thing that I need to be worried about. Reality may just be there, and that's it.
it's a brute fact.
No, well,
Yes.
there is a universe. We'll accept.
Yes.
We're not in dispute. There is a universe.
But we don't have an explanation.
How did the universe
Yes.
come about? I think the honest answer
Yes.
is I don't know,
Yes.
and I think the dishonest answer is a God did it.
Yes. Oh no, but by the way, I'm not saying about the universe coming into existence. Like myself, I don't believe the Kalam cosmological argument's a good argument. I really don't, because I would agree with your position that maybe the best position to be scientifically is agnostic about the issue. Okay, but I would go in and say that my whole point about bringing about the universe is the contingency of the universe. That there is a universe in the first place, even if it's been here for an infinite amount of time or for a finite amount of time, cries out for an explanation. Because it is simpler, like you said, that there is nothing at all.
That's still the question-begging fallacy.
Why is
It's
it so?
assuming
Yes.
that existence requires an existor?
No, I wouldn't. I would just simply say that you should have less brute facts within.
Yeah, if Aron would have just said, wait, but why should I accept the principle of sufficient reason? Then what Aron could have done by that question, which would have been a perfectly legitimately justified question for Aron to ask here, he would have then turned it back on to Dr. Joshua, who now has to give a good argument for why the PSR should be accepted, and then Aron could pick that apart if he saw it necessary. But I don't know if Aron is denying that there needs to be a reason here, or is just trying to hammer home the point that perhaps we don't know what it is yet. But for me, I would just, when it comes to the contingency argument, my first option is going to be to go for the principle of sufficient reason.
In your worldview, that you should try and.
And according to the 2020 Phil survey, the majority of philosophers do reject the principle of sufficient reason. Just throwing that out there as just sort of matter of factly.
That's the whole point. Yes.
You mentioned that you had evidence
Yes.
for God.
Yes.
What is it?
Okay. So I said to you, firstly, taken in as evidence that there is a universe, which you would agree with.
Okay, so
There is a universe, and we are
the
not
fact of
debating.
the universe.
Yes, there is a fact of the universe.
What is the evidence of
Okay.
God?
So then you go and say, should that going according to the criteria? Should there be a universe irrespective of God?
Yes,
Like why?
because nobody believes in absolute philosophical nothing. Not even the cosmologists believe in absolute philosophical nothing.
What do you mean by absolute philosophical nothing? Just so I understand.
Absolute nothing.
Okay, so
Right,
absolute
so
nothing.
there,
Yes.
there logically has to be something rather than nothing, because nothing is not possible.
Why?
Now, see, this is a this is a pretty strong claim. I don't know if I would make the idea that it's not logically possible that there be a literal absolute nothingness. I would just say that if there ever were such a thing, there isn't really a way for us to conceptualize or understand that, because of the nature of well, it's not that there. See, we're running into it now. We can't say of the nature of the thing that we're describing, because a pure nothingness isn't a thing and doesn't have a nature. So you could really only ever talk about what it isn't, because it isn't anything at all. So you could never talk about what it is. I think I would say that an absolute nothingness is probably more conceptual than anything. Like it's not a thing, because it's literally no thing. But to say it's just a difficult concept to actually talk about when you think about it.
There's nothing not possible. Sorry.
Physicists, they say nothing is
No, but you said philosophically, so I'm trying to understand metaphysically, why is nothing impossible? Because to show that nothing is impossible, you have to derive
what if you think about it this way?
contradiction
if
from
there,
it.
if
No, I don't
anywhere
see-
there is nothing,
Yes.
then the place where there is nothing has a boundary, and that boundary is something. And that already precludes it. You can't have anything anywhere if you have nothing
Yes.
somewhere.
But you're using a modal term, can and cannot. You are saying that it's logically impossible. Logical impossibility is a very strong statement.
Yeah.
Because you are saying nothing. The statement nothing
Right.
entails a contradiction. Same thing like a married bachelor entails a contradiction. That's why it's
Right.
logically impossible.
Right.
How
So-
is that there is nothing entails a contradiction?
I did just explain that.
No, but it doesn't entail a contradiction. This entail a contradiction, you then define the terms and they cancel
If
each other out.
nothing exists,
Yes.
and if nothing exists somewhere,
Yes.
and something exists somewhere else, then the place for the nothing is a place
In
for the
relation
nothing,
to the something.
Yes.
and it's a boundary with it. So it's a something.
Yes.
So
No, but-
absolute nothing is not possible.
No,
If
but
there's
you used
something
two different.
somewhere,
You used two different
can't-
terms. You said nothing exists somewhere. You didn't say everywhere. If you said nothing,
it doesn't matter.
One second.
Nothing can't exist anywhere
No.
if something exists somewhere else.
If you said nothing existed everywhere, but there is something, then those things will contradict each other.
So-
So you said nothing exists somewhere
So-
and something exists somewhere. How does that cancel each other out?
So-
Yes.
The hypothesis is
Yes.
so whether there
Yeah, this is actually quite simple. Joshua is just essentially asking for Aron, well, if it's logically impossible, what's the contradiction?
is a God or
Yes.
not, there's something instead of nothing. So
Yes.
where is the fact that indicates the God?
Okay. So I was trying to say to you, firstly, that there is a universe. That the universe.
Yeah, see, this is the thing. And the thing is, I do actually like how aggressive Aron can be in some discussions, especially when he's debating a lot of these creationists or these fundamentalists, because I think that when it comes to a worldview like that, you really need to go after it. You need to go after it hard and show that, look, no, that this is just bullshit, and this is how we know it. And if you keep trying to push it, I'm going to call you out for the liar that you are. But when it comes to discussions like these, when your interlocutor isn't that kind of person, I think that the reins can be pulled back or loosened a little bit, because the fact that Dr. Joshua here, the Dr. Sijuwade, is arguing points to is trying to utilize as evidence for God's existence is the fact that the universe exists. And he's going to say, well, okay, that is a contingent thing. It could have been that the universe did not exist. So, since I would presume, I'm quite certain that Dr. Sijuwade accepts the principle of sufficient reason, and I think in fact, he has a new argument from like metaphysical grounding or something like that. He presented it, I believe, on Capturing Christianity's channel a few days ago. I unfortunately didn't get to watch that video, at least not yet, but I do plan on watching it because I'm very interested in hearing it. But so I believe he has an argument that's something along the lines of the principle of sufficient reason is related to it, but I'm not going to comment much on it until I actually have an idea of it. But because Dr. Sijuwade would accept the principle of sufficient reason. He's going to argue, well, okay, if the universe exists, that's a fact. What explains that fact? Why does that fact obtain? What explains that? And for Dr. Sijuwade, it's going to be God. So, and again, that's the contingency argument. That's the route that he's trying to go down here. And, you know, as much as I love the guy, I think that not completely, but I think that there's an extent to which it's Aron is missing that a little bit. That's ultimately he's running, that Dr. Sijuwade is running a contingency argument.
Universe exists because it is not logically necessary that there is a universe. It is a logical contingent fact.
Nor is it relevant.
Sorry?
Nor is it relevant.
Why is it irrelevant?
Well, I don't know what you're referring
Yes.
to by a universe at this,
Yes.
because you say a
So I'm saying the
universe.
totality of reality that
Okay,
it
so
could be a
we
multiverse,
agree
it could be whatever.
that
Yes.
with a God or
Yes.
without a God, there's still something rather than nothing.
No, but I'm saying why should there be? That's the whole question.
Because it's impossible to have absolute nothing.
We're
Because
circling
something
back.
Yeah, I
exists
think
somewhere, logically, there can't be nothing anywhere.
No, but I'm trying to say to you that doesn't link up what you are saying.
Okay,
I'm
then we're just not going to get past
Okay,
this.
yeah. All I was just trying to say to you is that if you have a contingent fact, you are then trying to explain the contingent fact.
Okay,
By
so-
putting a hypothesis that explains the fact.
So,
So,
in
yes.
my hypothesis,
Yes,
okay,
yes.
no God,
No God, yes.
no nothing.
No, nothing, okay.
It's not possible to have nothing.
Yes,
so
okay.
we have to have
Okay.
something.
Yes.
That something takes the
Yes.
form of a universe.
Yes.
God or no God, we have a universe.
God or no God, we have, yes.
Right. So
Okay, go with-
where's
go
the
with-
indicator that there's a God?
Okay. So I'm simply saying to you that let's say you're not assuming that there is a God, or you're not putting the God as a hypothesis, that there is a universe, okay?
Right,
We
it's
agree.
unnecessary.
Okay, we agree on it. But then you have to go and say, either you take the universe as existence, that exists in the here and now, as a brute fact. We don't know. We might never know. It's just a brute fact. And there are some things in reality which are brute facts, which we can't explain. Okay? So you will have to take it as that, or you have to go.
That would follow along what my view is. Of course, I prefer the term brute contingency. I do believe that the universe ultimately is just a brute contingency. And I say this a lot, but I think it's just the best way to put it. And I think this man is the one. Well, he's the one that initially said it, and I think it's that's the best way to put it. And it's, to quote Carl Sagan, the universe just is. And that's all. Because I mean, again, going back, I reject the principle of sufficient reason. So I'm not going to have the same sort of commitments that Dr. Sijuwade would feel he has in terms of, say, explaining why the universe exists. That there is a universe. What explains that fact? What explains why that fact obtains? I would say, well, that there really isn't one. It just obtains. It just is. That's that. But naturally, theists running the contingency argument want to appeal to some sort of explanation. Well, the universe is contingent. It could not have existed, but it does. So why is that? I think that there's a much better approach to the contingency argument than what Aron has said. Though I do think there is some legitimacy to a lot of what Aron has said in terms of the contingency argument. I think that a much better job could be done responding to it.
Say that there is a deeper, more ultimate explanation for the universe, which we might
Why
not
do
have
we
at the
have
moment.
to have an explanation?
No, I just said to you, you have
Now, see, that was a very good question for Aron to ask right there. Why do we have to have an explanation? That question is very pivotal in this discussion, as I pointed out, because I'll harp on it. I'm a stickler about it. I think the PSR is just not a thing that we need.
have two options. So either you take it as a brute fact, you say there is no explanation, and they cannot be.
We don't have to
It's
say
that
there
we
is
don't
no
know it.
explanation.
Oh yeah. Oh, I was going to
What
say.
if we don't know
Yes.
the explanation?
Yes.
So
Yes.
we expect that there probably is one.
Yes. One second.
We don't know what the explanation
Yes.
is. What is your evidence
Yes.
that the explanation
Yes.
is a God?
Yes, because I'm saying to you that it's according to the criteria that you agreed with me, it actually fulfills the criteria. Because if you think about it,
The,
if
the
there,
criteria I agreed
Yes.
with is it God or no God? We have a universe.
no, that wasn't the criteria we said at the beginning. So the criteria we said at the beginning that you can generally use for scientific or historical hypothesis is if the hypothesis is true, it should lead us to explain to expect the evidence. Yes.
Let's understand it.
Yes.
To form the hypothesis,
Yes.
you must have evidence indicating the thing that you're looking at.
No, that's not
So you
necessarily
use
true.
the
You're assuming
you have evidence that indicates a
Then it's
God.
hypothesis of no
You
evidence.
then come up with a hypothesis to test that
No.
evidence to see if it's
No. It depends what type of probability theory you're holding to.
What
holding,
if you don't hold the probability
One second. So if you're holding, sorry.
Depends your methodology.
Yes. So I'm saying it depends on probability theory that you're holding to.
Yeah, I don't like
no,
that because the probability that I did everything I did yesterday at the exact time that I did everything I did in that exact order, if you measure up all those, how improbable all those things are, it's impossible.
Yes.
And yet I did it.
One second, but I'm not arguing against it. I'm saying to you, it depends. Your position that you just said depends on the probability theory that you're holding to. What I was talking about here is a logical.
I disagree.
1 second.
Probability has nothing to do with it.
Yes, it does. Of course it does. We're
Well,
talking
of
about
course it
hypotheses. Sorry, 1 second.
How is it
doesn't.
possible to create
Yes.
a probability of God?
What do you mean? How is it possible?
Because
Explain that
to
more.
say that something is probable, you must be able to say that something isn't probable. How do we get facts?
Now that was one thing I have to be honest, I didn't understand. To say that something is probable, you have to show that it's improbable. I don't even know if I can say if that's true or false because I don't really know what it means to say that. I have no. That one confused me.
Factors to relate to the probability of an ultimate being.
No,
I don't see how I could think what's the
you
probability.
can
of it.
use things like Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem is a theorem of probability. So simply you have
Every
a
atheist uses. So.
yeah, atheists can use. I'm saying generally you can use it for
Can
anything.
use.
No, I'm saying anyone. I said anyone can use it. Doctors.
Yeah, I think Dr. Sijuwade's argument here would just essentially be something like that the probability of the universe obtaining is greater given God's existence than the probability of the universe obtaining given God's non-existence, i.e. a contingency argument. What explains the obtention of the universe is God, or at least a God at the most basic level there.
Use it. It's just a simple probability factor. So you can use Bayes' theorem, have a hypothesis, have the evidence, and go and see if the evidence is likely given the hypothesis, and see if the evidence is likely given.
That
Yes.
evidence.
So I was simply saying to you, firstly, we have a contingent fact here.
You have to let him lay out what the evidence is. For some people, it's not just a simple statement as to what evidence is. There's more of a case to be made. Like if somebody asked me, what is the evidence for naturalism? I'm not going to be able to just like give them a one-liner. I'm going to want to lay out a cumulative case because I think that's what best accounts for my worldview. Or I think my worldview best accounts for what we see, and I think that a cumulative case best supports the worldview that I have.
That there is a universe. We have another
So
contingent.
what is the evidence
One second,
that the universe was
you're
brought
jumping
about by a God?
You're jumping in, can we get there first? Lay down the evidence, and then we can say does it explain or not.
I don't think we've
Yes.
laid down any
Yeah,
evidence.
I'm saying can we do that? I'm saying can we do
I'm
that?
asking you to do that.
Yeah, I'm saying can, but you jump in. So
Hold on
it's
just a
quite
second.
difficult.
Sorry. Hello?
Can you, well, just while he's talking that,
Yes.
have you defined what you mean by God?
Yes.
I'm
Oh,
surrounded by
no.
people and cameras.
Well,
That
first,
seems to be
sorry,
the first thing.
firstly, no, I think I
Yes,
did
I'm surrounded by
slightly.
people and cameras. So quick. What
I
is
think I
it?
did slightly, yes. But firstly, we're trying to say evidence, but he's jumping in a little
What?
bit. So, and then dismissing and saying it's not evidence, and then saying I need to bring
I can't
evidence.
hear
I
you.
mean, I need to understand what you
Okay,
mean
so
by God.
what I would say simply
Okay, I
by God is
will.
that there is a personal being who's omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly.
Sorry.
Right. Okay, so we've got that. So we know now where you stand.
Okay.
Right. So that's
So-
what needs falsifying.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I'll go. Okay. So I would say to just going with that evidence.
What evidence? I
Okay,
It's
missed
just
it.
define God and us.
Can I get there? Because you're jumping in. You're jumping in.
You've had the floor,
Yes.
and you keep going. I mean, this is
Yes.
disrespectful.
No, of course not.
But
Yes.
all I'm going to say is,
Yes.
you keep coming around with the same arguments.
Yeah.
He's asked you at least 3 or 4
Yes.
times
Yes.
your view,
Yes.
your life view,
Yes.
and your view on God.
Yes.
Or show
What
the
is that evidence?
Yes.
But you
But-
honestly haven't started.
Do you know what happens though? Do you know what happens when I'm saying? One second.
Can you not just get past
But-
this
but what-
initial hurdle and then talk
But
about?
can I finish? When I'm bringing it,
well,
normally.
really, because
So this is why I like doing
Can I
evolution.
finish my point?
People
Yeah,
ask
yeah.
me for evidence of evolution. I give it to them right then, and I don't have to have an argument. I don't have to have a philosophy. I don't have to talk
can I-
about probability.
Yeah, but that's the thing is that when it comes to having a complex worldview that is broad and would thereby, sort of commit itself to having to account for certain things that we see, that's what you have to do. You're never going to be able to appeal to only ever the empiric to substantiate that. I would never be able to defend my naturalist worldview if all I had was like a verificationist or an empiricist perspective. While I think that with regards to specifically that kind of evidence, I think naturalism certainly takes the cake. I think that there are other ways to bolster that and further show why naturalism is a I would argue the most parsimonious worldview to have.
I can just show the facts.
Can I just say something?
Yes, please.
I tried to say the evidence, but then you question me on it, and then we
No.
have to go back on it. So I'm saying,
Can you just
can I just say, and then we move on? Then we can start.
Can you just tell Aron the
Okay,
definition
so-
of God?
No. I want to hear the evidence.
Okay, okay, that there is a universe, that there is a contingent universe.
Okay, so that's the fact, not evidence.
First,
so what is the
oh,
evidence?
Goodness sakes, can
Right,
you like
so this fact,
just
this
okay,
fact,
evidence, whatever you
whether
want to
there
call
is a
it.
God or whether there is not a God, this fact remains the
But
same.
can
So
I
it
just-
is not evidence.
But can I just say something? Let me just say my things and then critique it, because you're critiquing each time and then I have to circle back, answer you, and then start again. Can I just say it and then you critique it? Is that fine? Okay. So that there is a universe, first line of evidence, fact, or whatever. Okay. That there is a contingent universe. That things within the universe are conformed to simple natural laws. Okay?
Right, another
That's number
indication
two.
that there is no God.
That's fine. Assess it later, but I'm saying yes. Okay.
Right.
Thirdly, that these simple natural laws are such by which to bring about the evolution of rational creatures. Okay.
Okay, another.
fourth-
The way you phrase it was a little muddy, but
Okay.
another indication.
See, I don't think he realizes that what Dr. Sijuwade is doing is he's running down. He's essentially providing what seems to me to be something like a cumulative case that, you know, so we have this fact, we have this fact, we have this fact, we have this fact. Now, what best accounts for not just any one of these facts individually, but for all of these facts together is, I think, God's existence. That seems to me to hear sort of the thing that Dr. Sijuwade is trying to lay out, and Aron is not really letting him get to that. Like, I understand not all of those individually are necessarily indicative of a theistic worldview, but much as I would do if I were having a discussion with somebody like Dr. Sijuwade and arguing from a naturalist perspective, I would be laying out a cumulative case for my worldview, because I think that that's what's going to demonstrate the parsimony of my worldview and the what I would argue that the greater probability of it accounting for the world the way that we experience it.
That there is no God.
Fourthly,
Okay.
Fourthly, can I finish?
God, please.
Okay. And the fourth one will be that there are these rational agents are conscious. Okay.
What
They
does
are conscious beings.
consciousness have to do with
Okay.
it?
One second. One second.
What does consciousness have to do with
Okay.
anything?
Can we assess it in a second? Because I mean, every time like you're jumping in saying, "Oh, but that's not."
We've got to like
that's not-
5, so let's
Okay.
keep going.
So no.
How many are
we'll
there?
just go with the four. We'll go
Okay.
with the four.
How many evidences of no God is he going to give me? Go ahead,
Only
please.
stating the fact.
Okay.
You're not stating any
Okay.
evidence. You're stating fact.
Number one. Okay. I think it's better first. I've said those four things, but let's just clarify. What do you mean by evidence, and what do you
The
mean by
fact
fact?
that indicates.
So
And here we're going to get into some pretty juicy stuff here, that because I think it's important to understand, you know, what facts are, what evidence is, and how these can relate if there are ways in which they do.
Objectively verifiable fact that is
That
positively
indicates
indicative
what?
of or exclusively concordant with only one available option over any other. This universe concords with no God. Every one of your examples concords with no God.
But can I say to you,
That I actually used to reiterate that as a definition for evidence, until I realized that it was too narrow. Because essentially under Aron's definition, if you saw me walking down the street and you heard a metal jingling sound in my pocket, at least according to Aron's view, because you can't, using that information alone, confirm whether it's keys or coins or jewelry, or I don't know, nails, bolts, washers, something like that. Therefore, it's that the sound is not evidence for any of those, since it doesn't indicate any of those, except it does. It indicates all of them, just not any one in part. It just not anyone in particular. So evidence does not have to indicate only one thing. Evidence is just that which confers justification. In my opinion, the way I would word it is evidence is that which confers justification for the acceptance of or the belief in some proposition. If you saw me walking down the street and you heard a metallic jingling sound in my pocket, that is evidence that I have keys in my pocket. You might not know that it's keys, but it's evidence that it could be keys. It's evidence that it could be coins. It's evidence that it could be nails or bolts or washers, or there's a variety of metal objects that I could have in my pocket that would make that sound. And that sound is evidence for all of them. Now, let's say you saw me walk out of the store after purchasing something and then heard the metal jingling sound in my pocket. I would argue that that adds more evidence that it was probably coins, because we all know that receiving some pocket change is is a common result of making purchases at your local convenience store. So then you would have further evidence that it's specifically coins, thus increasing even more the probability of specifically that as an account for the sound over any of the others. See, this is how evidence works. This is where understanding things like Bayesian probability and what have you, I think, come into play.
In the philosophical literature, that would not be evidence. That will
I would agree. You have not given evidence.
I'm saying the way you define evidence is not evidence. Because a proposition can have evidential value for multiple things, not just one thing.
But we're talking about scientific evidence.
Sorry?
I understand that historians may have a different application.
I'm not talking about historians.
But I know that you're not talking about historians. I'm saying that historians have a different context of what evidence means. But in science, evidence has a strict definition. It is the facts that indicate.
Okay, but I'm not talking about science. I'm simply no.
Yes,
one second.
You are.
When you're talking about theism, you're talking about metaphysics. Metaphysics is a philosophical.
Sorry, I'm talking about science. So I'm looking for evidence.
No, hold on.
If you're
the thing is, you can't really talk about science without, at least to some degree, talking about metaphysics. And the thing is, as we go deeper and deeper into science, metaphysics becomes more important. So, for instance, I'm sure Aron would probably agree with me on the fact that time is tenseless, and that this serves a serious blow to the Kalam cosmological argument and to presentism as a worldview and things like that. But the nature of time, whether it's tensed or tenseless, is a metaphysical issue. I'm sure Aron would probably agree with me that causality is not a thing that's fundamental to reality, and it may not be present at all scales of reality. But what causality is in reality, and whether it's present across all scales of reality, is a metaphysical issue. The foundations of quantum mechanics is not entirely, because there's still a lot of observation and things like that go into it, but it is largely a metaphysical issue. So people hear these words and think it means things it doesn't really mean.
If you're telling me,
Can I jump in? When you are talking or when you are debating about the existence of God, it's a metaphysical discussion. It's not a scientific discussion.
It is.
No, one second.
If there was a God, it would be a matter of science.
1 second. You bring in scientific evidence to support the hypothesis or not, but it is a metaphysical discussion.
And science is the only tool we have to test anything.
Of course it's not. You have metaphysics.
You can't test.
Okay, hold on.
So I don't know whether it's the hypothesis or not, but it is a metaphysical discussion.
Right here. Listen very, very carefully.
And science is the only tool we have to test anything.
Of course it's not.
Did you hear that? Science is the only tool we have to test anything with. That's scientism. Straightforwardly. Not a position I think I would want to commit myself to personally.
You have metaphysics.
You can't test anything.
How can you not test things in metaphysics?
How can you?
Sorry.
In metaphysics.
Okay, there are moral values. Can we find that out or not? Or can you find that in a scientific way?
Yes, you can find it.
In science? Tell me how you can do that in
absolutely.
science.
Everything we actually know about anything we get from
Wait, so,
science.
hold on.
What? I'm kind of at a loss for words on that one. I mean, I just yeah, he's definitely not a philosopher. But I think the point that's being made, or at least one of the points that I would make, is if you're going to engage in these kinds of discussions, I do think that I do think that having an understanding of philosophy is certainly useful, and I think that we're kind of seeing why that's the case now. There, I guess I don't know with regards to Aron, but for me, I would say in terms of what we know, what truth is as a concept and all that, was not understood through science. Yet it's still something that we know, something that we can talk about. So pushing this sort of this scientific worldview is just not. I got to be honest. I think it's kind of cringe.
Hold on. That statement is self-defeating. Just to tell you. That everything that we know comes from science. Is that scientific?
Yes.
How is that? Tell me. Did you use a scientific methodology to get to that statement?
Yes.
No, it's a self-defeating
because everything we want to say is true or false. There is a scientific way to determine.
No, 1 second. You just made a categorical statement that's self-defeating.
But it's not self-defeating.
You said you said everything that we know. Right. I'm paraphrasing. Maybe everything that we can know to be true.
Right.
Is found through science.
We can demonstrate.
It through science. Now that statement demonstrates it through science.
What?
Demonstrate that sentence that you just uttered through science.
All right.
Because you believe it to be true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pick anything.
No. That statement. Demonstrate it through science.
I will with this example. Pick anything you want. Let's. Anything you want. Pick from all of the things you want to say.
No. You didn't understand what I just said.
Your statement.
No. Your statement you just made.
Anything that you want to say is true or false, we can use science to determine that.
Now that statement, is it true?
The statement
you just
uttered. Because we can demonstrate that. That was the example.
Demonstrate it through science.
Then are you going to let us do that?
Do it.
Let me do the thing you're asking me to do.
Demonstrate that sentence.
I said, yes.
You just said that is true for science.
Yes, I'm exactly doing that thing. Quit interrupting the answer.
I won't. I'll let you speak.
Okay, with the question.
Sorry. We'll catch up after, yeah?
Anything you want to say is true or false. Yes. We can demonstrate through science. You want to say true, pick something that you would say is true or false. That you think we can't prove through science.
The problem here is, yes, Dave has it 100% correct. Aron is not understanding that he made a universal statement. All things that we know through science. And Dr. Sijuwade is asking him, okay, you believe that statement to be true, demonstrate the truth of that statement through science. And then Aron, instead of doing that, appeals to a particular instance of the truth of the statement, rather than demonstrating its universal truth. It was a universal statement. You can't show the truth of a universal statement by appealing to particular instances of its application. That's just not how that works. It's like saying, well, all swans are white because the swans at this one zoo, and they're the only swans I've seen, are white. That's not how that works. You can't do that. And that's essentially what Aron is trying to do here. He's trying to use particular instances of the truth of a statement to demonstrate that it is a universally true statement. And he's well mistaken in doing that.
But you don't understand why I just asked you. That categorical statement that you just uttered. Mm-hmm.
It's demonstrated by this example.
1 second.
It's demonstrated by this example.
No. The proposition itself. Right. That sentence.
Right.
That
exact sentence is demonstrated by the example I'm giving you.
But 1 second. That sentence that you just uttered, you did not use the scientific methodology to hold to that sentence being true.
Yes, I did, because I can demonstrate it.
How? Scientifically?
And test it scientifically by giving you the example. The example was, anything you want to say is true or false, we can use science to demonstrate that. So pick something
your
Shall I
sentence.
do it? Shall I
No,
do it?
but-
Because
no.
this is a waste of time, man.
Okay.
This
It's
is
not-
not
why is it a waste of time?
Because we've had the same thing
No,
maybe 17
because-
times.
What's
No,
it-
but
no, no,
his
but-
point is actually right. What you're speaking about is logical positivism, and he's challenging that.
Yes, I'm saying to you, yes, you are, because you're using the verification
No,
principle.
because I don't
You are
even
using-
get
it's
into
a self-defeating-
verificationism.
It's a self-defeating statement.
What he actually said is correct. That
Yeah, so Border is nailing it on the head right here. Yeah, he's getting into this idea that the only way we can know things is essentially through the empirical methodologies. Okay, so show me that you know that sentence is true universally, like you're claiming, through purely empirical methodologies. And Aron is saying, okay, let's appeal to at one particular instance of its truth to demonstrate that universally it is true. That is fallacious. You cannot do that. And Dr. Sijuwade is trying to point that out to him, that you can't use particular instances of the truth of something to show that it's universally true. That's just not how that works.
you're saying that you can statement that science is our best root of knowledge. You can't test that scientifically. That's
Which we
self-refuting.
can.
So he's actually
It's
right.
not
So,
self-refuting, it's
No, but I'm
just
saying,
demonstrable.
no, but I'm saying,
And the way to demonstrate that very sentence was to use the example he's asking for.
no, it's not. No, so one second.
And I'm
I'm
not
not-
talking about logical
No,
positivism.
so I'm not.
And I don't get into verificationism.
No,
Everybody
but
wants to
that
paint
is
me
a
with
very.
something I don't
No,
know.
but I'm saying that is a form of.
Well, I have to be honest here. I think Aron doesn't own these because he doesn't know that that's ultimately what he's advocating for. Because he did essentially just advocate for scientism. And that's why he's now being called out on by two different people now on that same thing. That if you're going to claim that everything that we can know through science, demonstrate that that statement is true using science, and since it's a universal statement, you can't appeal to particular instances of its truth. That isn't enough to get you to it being true universally. That would be a fallacy to do so, and that was completely missed.
Verification principle. That's why it hasn't been held by the majority of the majority of philosophers at least 40, 50 years.
I don't hold
Yeah,
the
so-
verification.
But you were just uttered it.
Yeah, Dr. Sijuwade is correct. The positivist movement, I don't think was I don't think it was long-lived, but it simply isn't held to by the vast majority of philosophers today.
Said it. You've just
No,
literally
I
uttered it.
didn't.
Yes, it is, and it's self-defeating.
It's not self-defeating.
It is because it shoots
If I
itself
can
in the foot.
demonstrate the statement is true, and I can,
Yes.
then it's not
No, but you
self-defeating.
can't demonstrate it in a scientific way.
Yes,
That's the whole
we
way.
can.
How?
By the example I just
You
gave you.
can't demonstrate the verification principle through science.
All right, never mind.
No,
Never
so I'm
mind.
saying, so it's self.
I think you are self-refuting. We're having a nice time spinning around
No, I'm not.
circles
I'm just
here.
saying.
coming in from a neutral perspective. He's actually right.
I'm just
My
saying.
ass.
No, I'm just saying philosophically, it was self-defeating. But secondly, anyway.
Okay, it's not
okay,
because I can
okay,
demonstrate.
okay. Moral
To be honest, you're wrong on this point.
Okay.
Just this point.
Yeah.
The rest of the conversation I didn't really
I've
get, but that
debated
point,
you. You were wrong on everything you ever said.
Okay, leaving
I'm
that
not going to
aside.
start being
Okay,
wrong now. Just
okay.
'cause you're here.
Moral values.
No, wait,
Moral values. How can you find that out?
Wait,
from
hang
true
on,
or
hang on,
false
hang on.
in a scientific way?
Aron,
Because what?
the point that he actually made, you said that science is the best root of knowledge, correct?
Right.
And you
Well,
said
actually,
that,
I said that anything you say to be true or false, we have a scientific means of determining that.
Right.
And then he said, "Can you prove that sentence to be correct?" Yes, I can.
And you said
And the way
scientifically.
that I can is by having him, and the way that I can prove it scientifically is by have you choose something that you can say is true or false, and then we can show how we can show that scientifically, proving the sentence, not.
But that only proves that the sentence is true with respect to that particular instance, Aron. It wouldn't show that it would be necessarily true for any other instance, but the statement would be saying that in other instances it would also be true. And I'm sure Aron would say, well, we could just go to those instances and then show that it's true. Yeah, but then again, its truth only holds within the instances that we've shown that it holds, not necessarily in any instance where we haven't. You cannot appeal to particular applications of the truth of that utterance to show that it is true universally. You just can't do it.
Self-refuting,
Shall I tell you what?
demonstrably correct.
can I explain why that's self-refuting? Let me just explain. Just 1 second. Yeah? Look, I'm just coming in from a neutral perspective. I am. Because you two are actually having this debate.
No, you're not.
So? So,
Well,
but why am I not? Why could I not be neutral if I'm a theist?
So Subur is technically correct here. He wasn't a part of this discussion. He's just coming in as like a third party. That's what he means. I'm coming in as somebody without a dog in this fight. Just coming in to say that, well, quite frankly, Aron is technically incorrect here. And technically, yes, Aron is incorrect here. He is advocating for the thing he's claiming he's not advocating for.
The core of the discussion was about whether God exists.
No,
No, it
that's
wasn't.
what we
No,
were
no, that's
debating.
not what I
We were
heard.
debating about.
I heard.
So it's
We were about
entirely
to-
in isolation.
No, this
No,
is
but we were
entirely
debating about
philosophy.
verification.
Okay.
Which, by the way,
Being disingenuous.
all I'm trying to say is, look,
No, but it wasn't about
his
theism, it was about
actual
verification
point
at
is
that
actually
The
correct.
reason for talking
And the
is
reason why,
talking about
one second.
His point is that we can't be talking about God in a scientific way. If God was real, and I'm asking for evidence of God, damn Skippy, I'm asking for scientific evidence.
That
Now,
means-
if he doesn't
wait, hang
have
on,
scientific
wait, hang
evidence, he can tell me he has evidence of a different
Okay, but-
type that doesn't qualify as scientific evidence.
No,
in which
but
case,
this-
he
this-
didn't
this-
have
this-
no
this-
scientific
Can I
evidence.
just clarify?
But one point here. That means you disagree with methodological naturalism.
No, it doesn't.
So what does methodological naturalism mean?
Methodological naturalism means that you don't come up with supernatural explanations for things.
Yeah, but it
Fantastic.
assumes metaphysical
So
naturalism.
how can you use a method which assumes methodological naturalism to prove something that's supernatural?
Again, if I'm asking for scientific
That was actually a pretty good question there by Subur. I'm not gonna lie. That was pretty slick what he just did there. Gotta give credit where credit's due.
evidence that it is going to have to be a body of objectively verifiable facts that positively comport
Okay,
to only
didn't answer
one
the question.
object.
You didn't answer-
Yeah, but that's empirical evidence. That's just a definition of empirical. Lord have mercy.
Actually answer the
Can I
question.
just?
I
Okay,
did
one
answer
second.
you.
I-
Actually
one
answer
second.
the
I'm
question.
actually trying to help you out. Just one second,
Okay,
yeah? So, look,
You are maddening.
here's the point.
All right, so that was that video. Only a little over an hour. This actually went a little bit shorter than I thought it was. Maybe I didn't talk as much as I normally do, but yeah, you know, I love Aron, love most of his work. Been watching his videos for about 4 years now. I think he's brilliant at what he does, but I do have some criticisms of some of his techniques, and I do think that there are ways that he could improve. And I just wish that with some of us who you know, try to acknowledge that and say, look, you know, there are ways in which I think you could improve your discourse. Maybe you don't think you need to, but I think it's worthwhile to do so. But one of the big things that I wanted to show with this video is that having you know, a basic understanding of these philosophical concepts, I think largely is useful, especially if you're going to be engaging in these types of dialogues. If you're going to be going out there and engaging in debates and discussions as it concerns theism and atheism, if you're going to be arguing, you know, for an atheistic perspective or a naturalist perspective, or if you're going to be providing counter apologetic perspectives, then I think it serves one well to have preferably a strong understanding of philosophy, but at least a basic understanding of it. That way, going in, you understand argumentation, you understand reason, you understand how to approach these things, and I think it allows for a more fruitful discussion. Your mind isn't so closed off to differing perspectives or differing methodologies as it seemed Aron's was in this discussion, where he just wasn't having it if it weren't scientific evidence, if it wasn't scientific evidence. So I hope everybody enjoyed this short little stream. Thank you guys for coming by. There's some people here that, at least if and assuming they haven't, you know, made any comments before and I've missed them, it's the first time I've seen them in my live chat, which is really nice. So thank you all for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed the stream, and stay tuned. There are a few other videos I'd like to put out in this coming week. This week. Hopefully I can get one out tomorrow. I don't know if I will or not, but certainly stay tuned. And remember, as always, through reason we progress.